Qatar has welcomed a ruling by the UN's top court that orders the UAE to reunite families separated by its blockade. But will the UAE government comply with the order? And what impact will this have on the Gulf crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. It's the first ruling by the UN's top court on the Gulf crisis. The International Court of Justice has ordered the United Arab Emirates to immediately allow Qatari-UAE mixed families who were separated by the blockade on Qatar to reunite. In June 2017, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt and the UAE imposed a land, sea and air blockade, accusing Qatar of supporting terrorism, a charge Doha strongly rejects. Qatar filed a case at the ICJ, arguing the UAE had violated an international convention on racism when it expelled thousands of Qatari citizens during the first weeks of the crisis. Monday's ruling was preliminary. The final decision on the case is not expected for months. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Neve Barker at The Hague.
Qatar's legal battle with the United Arab Emirates has dealt a defining blow. The International Court of Justice says the measures taken by the UAE after the blockade of Qatar amount to racial discrimination.
According to Qatar, the UAE has failed to respect its obligations.
The ICJ's ordered the UAE immediately to allow Qatari families expelled from the country to be reunited, students to finish their studies, and those Qataris affected access to Emirati courts and tribunals. The order, said the ICJ president, is compulsory.
The court reaffirms that its orders on provisional measures under Article 41 of the statute have binding effect and thus create international legal obligations for any party to whom the provisional measures are addressed.
Last June, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Egypt severed diplomatic ties with Qatar and imposed a land, sea and air blockade, accusing Qatar of funding extremism, accusations it denies. Qatar says its citizens were either illegally expelled or denied access to the UAE, separating families and denying people access to healthcare, education, their properties and assets.
Of course, the UAE is only one of the 4 countries to have imposed a blockade on Qatar, but it's the only one out of the 4 to be brought here before the International Court of Justice. Why? Because it's the only country out of the 4 that signed up to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. But Bahrain, Egypt and Saudi Arabia will be watching this case closely and drawing their own conclusions.
This is a statement that there is a likelihood of discrimination. So one would think that the other states in the region would say, that means something. Again, likely that this is a violation.
In earlier hearings, the UAE denied any policy of expulsion, saying its measures were designed to have the least possible impact on ordinary citizens. It said its argument was with the Qatari government, not the Qatari people. But the UAE must comply with the court or face further legal action. Qatar could go to the UN Security Council and demand an enforcement order. This is one of a string of legal challenges mounted by Qatar to try and end the blockade, a ruling the country will welcome, but whether it will help end the blockade, now in its 14th month, is less certain. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, The Hague.
Now, the UAE issued a statement after the court ruling saying, contrary to Qatar's false allegations, thousands of Qataris continue to reside in and visit the UAE. Qatari visitors may enter the UAE with prior entry permission issued through the telephone hotline. We urge Qatar to constructively engage on the requests made by the UAE and other countries for Qatar to comply with its international obligations. Now, we'd like to point out that we did reach out to officials and analysts in the UAE for comment on this story, but they've all declined to come on the program. So let's bring in our guest. Joining us here in Doha, Abdulaziz Alhorr, Director of the Diplomatic Institute at the Qatari Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on Skype from the Croatian city of Dubrovnik. Toby Cadman, an international human rights lawyer, and in London, Afzal Ashraf, visiting fellow at the Centre for Conflict, Security and Terrorism at Nottingham University. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being on the program today. Toby Cadman in Croatia, I'd like to start with you because you're an expert of the International Court of Justice, and I'd like to clarify for our viewers what this ruling by the ICJ, a preliminary ruling, means, because we're getting a different spin on it from the official news agency in the UAE at least. Which party does this provisional ruling favour?
Thank you. Well, certainly the ruling is in favour of the state of Qatar. That's clear. There have been a number of statements coming out from the UAE that it's not a decision. It's an order. Well, I mean that's a question of semantics, to be honest. The decision that has been issued by the International Court of Justice is a ruling in favour of Qatar, following their request for provisional measures. And as is quite clear from the decision, and I would direct your listeners to read the decision rather than any statement coming out of the UAE, is very clear that it accepts jurisdiction. It accepts that the matters being complained of fall within and fall within the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And it's ironic, to say the least, that the UAE is expecting Qatar to respect international law, which UAE has shown through its own actions that it has complete disregard for.
Toby, a provisional victory for Qatar, but it's not the end of the case.
It's certainly not the end of the case. It's the very beginning of the case. But it's an important first ruling that upholds the position the state of Qatar has taken, that this is a matter that falls within the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and that the acts complained of are capable of being considered violations of the international convention. So those are two very important rulings that the International Court of Justice has made. And it's also important to note that the International Court of Justice disregarded the closing remarks by the UAE when the UAE tried to argue that despite the statement of June of last year from their own foreign ministry, that there wasn't any action that was being taken. And the International Court of Justice did not accept that. So the position that the UAE has put forward has been disregarded. Of course, proceedings before the International Court of Justice are very long,
right,
and very complex,
right,
involving matters of international law and facts.
Okay.
So this is likely to go on for some time, but it's an important first ruling, certainly.
Okay. Abdulaziz Alhorr here in Doha. As Toby says there, very important to point out that this order does not constitute a final ruling on the case, and it could be months, if not years, before a final decision on the case brought by Qatar is made. So why is Qatar welcoming this initial ruling, even though it's not the final decision?
Actually, I agree with our colleague. This is a very first step in a long trial, maybe the marathonic one. But from our perspective, it shows how the political behavior of Qatar is. It shows the professionalism, and it shows the proper approach that Qatar is taking in the crisis or the existing crisis and struggle with the blockading country. It shows when Qatar has said to the whole world that our people have been victimized, our people have been discriminated against. We were really right about this, that really our Qatari people have been discriminated against, not only in UAE.
But as you know, Abdulaziz, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The UAE until today insists that it has done nothing wrong, that these violations committed are not real, because Qatari citizens still live and work in the UAE and are still being allowed into the UAE.
I mean, they have been saying this, and they are saying this, and they will be saying this in the future as well. You can see this after the decisions, and still they are repeating the same story again. But Qatar was able to prove that the Qatari people have been discriminated against by showing evidence of this, not by talking about it. It's really that we are living in this country, we have relatives, we have friends, we have colleagues, we have professional people. All of these people have been discriminated against, especially students and relatives and families.
Okay, let me bring in Afzal Ashraf in London now. What's your reading of this ruling? Do you think it's a victory for Qatar?
Well, I think it might be a victory for Qatar, but it's an even bigger victory for the international system. I think that what we're seeing here is one party using the concept that right is might, and the other party is using the concept that might is right. So what we have is a number of states who are allied against Qatar. Whatever the dispute between them, I'm not going to comment on it, but the point is that they are using political, economic and other leverage to force a change of behavior. What Qatar has done is use international legal systems to enforce their rights.
Right, but by going through the legal
it's a significant
means,
victory.
I want to ask you about a point you just made there that it's very interesting, I think. Do you think by going the legal route, Qatar is complicating a political resolution of the crisis?
I think that it could do. It very much depends on how people react to it. But the point I think that is inherent in this ruling is that you mustn't mix politics with people. It's the next worst things to mixing politics and religion. So what it appears, certainly the reading of the court, is that whatever the political issue, and they've still to discuss that, it is wrong to make individual citizens pay for the price of a political conflict. And I think that's a significant underlying point.
Toby Cadman in Dubrovnik, my next question to you is the ruling by the ICJ enforceable? If the UAE decides that it doesn't want to implement what is advised by the court, what happens then? What are the ramifications?
Well, I think the first point to re-emphasise is that, and I quite like the way your guest from London put it. Here we have a situation where the UAE has tried to use bullying tactics to prevent any kind of action being taken, and to prevent the international community from really scrutinising the illegality of the blockade and the consequences of the blockade. So I think it's important to look at that. And of course, the ICJ is a judicial body which is fully independent and impartial and is immune from outside pressure. Now, in terms of whether they will follow the ruling, I very much doubt that they will do anything to implement the ruling, as their statement that they've issued clearly indicates that they consider it to be wrong. They do not consider anything they do to be subject to external scrutiny. And this is one of the biggest problems with the UAE and the other blockading states, is that's the default position. In terms of enforcing it, yes, of course it can be enforced.
How?
It can be UN Security Council.
So the International Court of Justice itself doesn't have power of enforcement. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes. I mean, if you have one of the most important rulings the International Court of Justice has ever issued, which relates to the wall in Jerusalem. Now that wall still stands, despite the finding that it is illegal. So it is a difficulty in in international law in ensuring that there is an enforceability mechanism. But what you have to understand is that not only the UN Security Council, but through other mechanisms of the United Nations, the question really has to be, does the United Arab Emirates wish to establish itself as a pariah state? Because that's where it's heading. It has tried to get the international community to support it in creating the state of Qatar as a vassal state under the authority of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and to a lesser extent Egypt, and that has failed. Now they are up against actual legal reasoning from a credible body which has dismissed the arguments that it has made in defence and said that it is in breach of international law.
Right.
As we heard from the statement of the UAE, they're calling for the state of Qatar to respect international law again.
Right.
That's what they're going to have to face.
Yeah, it seems that we're just going round and round in this crisis. Let's just remind our viewers of how it all unfolded. On May 23rd, 2017, the Qatar news agency was hacked. False statements attributed to the country's leader were posted on its website and broadcast by Saudi and Emirati media. The hacking came 3 days after US President Donald Trump met Arab leaders at the Riyadh summit. On June 5th, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt cut ties with Qatar, imposing a land, sea and air blockade. They accused Doha of supporting terrorism, an allegation Qatar has strongly denied. Now, the blockading countries ordered thousands of Qatari residents to leave their countries and demanded that their own citizens living in Qatar return home. Then they sent Qatar a list of 13 demands that included curbing relations with Iran, closing a Turkish military base and shutting down the Al Jazeera media network. Abdulaziz Alhorr, what do you respond to those who say that Qatar is undermining any possible political or diplomatic settlements to this crisis by going the legal route?
Actually, in fact, Qatar from day one respected the Kuwait as a mediator in the case. They asked for these blockading countries to come around the table and express all their concerns on the table with one condition only: to come to the table without preconditions, without really imposing anything that will affect the sovereignty and independency of the Qatar. That was the only principle that was not negotiable: the sovereignty and the independency of the country. And still today is calling for the to come to the negotiation table, and tomorrow they will continue to call for this. Actually, they have shown by evidence to the ICJ that we have called for a negotiation and to come to the negotiation table. But all of these attempts have been rejected. We responded positively to the Kuwaiti mediator. We responded positively to everybody who tried to mediate with the blockading countries, but all what we hear, all what we receive is a total rejection and an escalation that have been based on a very fake and troubling news. Okay,
so you're saying that Qatar had really no choice now than to go to the International Court of Justice. Afzal Ashraf.
Exactly.
Afzal Ashraf, what impact do you see this ruling having on the battle for influence in Western capitals? We've seen the Emir of Qatar in London on Tuesday. He's travelled to Washington as well, and so have the blockading countries. They've been, waging a battle of influence really in Western capitals. What impact do you see this ruling having on the position of Western countries in this crisis?
Well, I think that certainly Qatar has won, if you like, a goal in the battle of influence. It's very much in the lead on this particular issue. And this particular issue relates, of course, as we've already discussed, to the human rights of people affected in this dispute. It doesn't address the wider dispute at this stage. That is probably going to be downstream. And I think that what I would hope that all the parties involved in this dispute take time out and think very carefully about their strategies.
Right.
The battle of influence can work both ways. What they should do is look at the history of interstate politics and conflict resolution before the First World War, and how alliances, and this is what we're talking about in this case, is alliances both regional as well as international,
right,
who are having influence on the parties involved, and how that can very rapidly fall apart and cause major problems, but far bigger than the conflict that we're dealing with right now. So, if they can in any way come together and try to resolve their problems through mediation. We've heard about the possibility of mediating through Kuwait and other countries. That is going to be much more sustainable and a much more effective solution than lobbying international powers for influence, because they will respond to their own interests, which aren't necessarily the same as the local.
And speaking of mediation, you mentioned Kuwaiti mediation there, and we've also heard the possibility of U.S. mediation. There's been talk of a summit at Camp David, possibly in September, between Donald Trump and leaders of these countries in this region. Do you see this decision having an impact on that? Can this summit still take place in the current context?
Well, I hope so. I think it should do. And one point that I hope Toby is wrong about, and I hope he's wrong, I'm not saying he is that I think my reading of some of the statements the UAE has made to Reuters is that they're claiming that they're complying with the resolution of the International Court of Justice. So they say they're complying according to their national regulations. So they have a face-saving way out of this. I don't think that anybody should start creating, if you like, embarrassing situations for other parties in this. What I think this ruling could do is show that if people can sit down and talk about rights as opposed to politics, then you are likely to get a better solution. And I would say that regional solutions are probably more sustainable than international solutions, because the US, with the best will in the world, will be approaching this from its national interest.
Let's hear from Toby.
Those may not coincide with other people's interests.
Let's allow Toby to respond. And Toby, I also want to ask you about, you talked about the possibility of the case being referred to the to the UN Security Council if, it wasn't resolved at the level of the International Court of Justice. If that were to happen, who stands to benefit from the case going all the way to the UN Security Council?
Well, first of all, to respond, I also hope I'm wrong. I don't think I am, but I do hope I am wrong, and that the UAE sees this, or actually all sides see this as an opportunity. Of course, everybody wants to see a political solution to this rather than protracted litigation. The difficulty is Qatar has tried that, and it's failed. They have attempted to mediate the problem, as the guest from London said, with the Kuwaiti assistance, but that wasn't successful, and so Qatar was forced to initiate litigation because that was the only way to resolve this issue. Of course, if it goes to the UN Security Council, we don't know which way that's going to go.
Okay.
We don't know what level of support they're going to get.
Okay.
But again, what I hope for is that it only goes to the Security Council as sort of the last-ditch attempt to ensure compliance.
Okay.
Hopefully, the UAE will comply with the decision, and things will change.
All right. Let's give the last word to Abdulaziz Alhorr here in Doha. How do you see Qatar placed today in terms of the international community, and where do you see this crisis going? Do you think it can be resolved in the next few months?
I hope it can be resolved. We resolved the previous one. We sat on the table. We really discussed the concern why it doesn't happen this time. So I do have the hope that it will be resolved. But I mean, for this to be resolved, there is only one way for resolving it. It's a dialogue, and dialogue. This is the only way to do it. I agree with our colleagues that Qatar has been been left with no choice but going to the international law legal system to claim the rights for its own people, protecting their people, and making sure that they receive a proper and just dealing with in these countries.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very interesting conversation. Abdulaziz, Alhorr, Toby Cadman, Afzal Ashraf, thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching, and bye for now.